In the fall of 2008, if a combine quit in Mercer County, Illinois, there was one place you called and one man who expected you to call it. That place was Callaway Farm Equipment, a dealership sitting off Route 17 with a gravel lot wide enough to hold 12 new combines in a straight line and a service bay that smelled like hydraulic oil, hot steel, and harvest panic. The man was Trent Callaway, 46 years old that year, third-generation dealer, clean cap, pressed work shirt, good watch, good handshake, and the sort of confidence that tends to grow in men who have spent 20 years standing between farmers and the machines they cannot afford to have fail. That was the arrangement. That was the gravity. If your separator light came on in October, you called Trent. If your unloading auger stopped turning with 1,100 bushels of wet corn still standing, you called Trent. If your feeder house chain snapped at dusk with rain moving in from the west, you called Trent. Not because there were no other mechanics in Mercer County. There were. But because Callaway sold the combines, stocked the parts, ran the service trucks, held the warranty accounts, and had spent 15 years teaching the county that modern harvest moved through him. Now let me tell you about Vernon Hale, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what happened when the county ran out of time and everybody suddenly remembered the value of things they had spent years calling junk. Vernon Hale was 79 years old in 2008 and had farmed the same 520 acres outside of Aledo for 51 years. His father had rented the ground first in 1947, then bought the home quarter in 1953 after 3 dry years, 2 good wheat crops, and a bank officer who finally decided the Hales were not going anywhere. Vernon had grown up in a house where bolts were saved in coffee cans, ledger sheets were folded twice and slid into drawers, and no machine part left the property until someone in the family could explain exactly why it could never be used again. He had learned that from his father, Raymond, who had run a pull-type combine behind a steel-wheeled tractor in the years before self-propelled harvesters became the law of the land. Raymond Hale did not believe that old equipment was sentimental. He believed it was specific. A gear was not old. It was a gear with a tooth count, a shaft diameter, a load history, and a shape that had taken steel and labor to become what it was. Vernon learned that young, and once a boy learns to look at machinery that way, he does not entirely stop. By 2008, Vernon had what most of the county referred to as the barn behind the machine shed, and what Trent Callaway referred to, with a laugh that got bigger every time he used the phrase, as a cathedral of obsolete junk. It was a timber frame barn built in 1939, sided in weathered oak, roof patched with 3 different generations of tin, floor creaking under the weight of 60 years of crop seasons. Inside were shelves, rafters, bins, pallets, hanging chains, pulleys, sprockets, cast housings, feeder shafts, bevel gears, separator couplings, clean grain elevator drives, old unloading auger elbows, corn head snouts, wobble boxes, knife drives, fan pulleys, straw chopper brackets, hydraulic valves, bearing carriers, and parts from machines that had not been sold new in Mercer County since Gerald Ford was in office. Vernon did not keep everything. That is the important part. Men who do not understand such barns think the difference between a hoarder and a mechanic is only a matter of floor space. It is not. The difference is discrimination. Vernon kept what still had geometry in it. What still had material in it. What still had a future if the right problem arrived. He had labeled shelves in carpenter's pencil. He had wire tags on the larger pieces. He had a notebook, not fancy, just a ruled ledger from the farm office, in which he had written where things came from and what might mate to what if a man ever needed them in a hurry. He had done that for 32 years. Trent Callaway found all of this faintly embarrassing in the way modern dealers often find old mechanical habits embarrassing. He did not dislike Vernon. That is worth saying. Trent was not a cruel man. He was a current man. He believed in clean inventories, factory support, superseded part numbers, and the natural order of things as defined by the latest catalog. If a part had been discontinued, then it had, in Trent's world, completed the useful portion of its existence. That was what discontinuation meant. Vernon disagreed. The first time Trent saw the barn, sometime around 1998, he had walked in behind Vernon looking for an old hitch pin Vernon said he still had from a 6-row planter setup. Trent had stood in the doorway a moment and looked at the shelves. He had laughed and said, "Vern, if I ever retire, I'm calling the county scrap crew and telling them your barn's got enough junk in it to build a bridge." Vernon had said, "No. Enough in here to keep harvest moving when your computer says the warehouse is empty." Trent had laughed again. It was not a mean laugh. But it was a settled one. The kind of laugh a man gives when he hears a line he files under old men and their old ways. Let me tell you about the machines that began failing in 2008, because you need to understand the failure before you can understand why Vernon Hale's barn suddenly became the most important square footage in Mercer County. The combines that year were bigger than the county had run 10 years earlier and heavier than the ground wanted them to be. Corn had come in wetter than normal after a late summer that could not decide whether it intended to finish warm or die cold. Fields held. Stalks stayed tough. Yields were good enough to make men hurry and bad enough to make them nervous. Everyone wanted to get across every acre before the rain that kept building out west finally committed to the sky. Callaway Farm Equipment had sold 19 late-model machines into Mercer and the 2 surrounding counties over the previous 4 seasons. Most of them were good machines. This story is not about a bad combine. It is about a weak point. Specifically, a feeder drive coupler assembly that had been changed under a supplier revision 2 winters earlier. The revised coupler used a lighter cast hub mated to a sealed bearing carrier and a spline stub shaft intended to absorb shock under normal crop loads. Normal crop loads are a useful phrase. They describe conditions that exist in engineering meetings far more often than they exist in Illinois in October. In wet corn, with heavy residue, chopper demand, and operators trying to make up 2 lost days before rain, those couplers began to fail. Not all at once. Not dramatically at first. A vibration here. A heat line around the carrier there. Then a cracked hub. Then a broken spline. Then a feeder drive that lost alignment just enough to chew a bearing and take the rest of the assembly with it. The first machine went down on October 9th. The second on the 10th. By the 13th, Trent had 5 service trucks running from dawn into the dark. At first, he thought it was coincidence. Then he thought it was operator load. Then he thought it was one shipment. By the time he knew it was a pattern, the parts shelf in his dealership had already been stripped nearly clean. The warehouse in Moline had 6 assemblies. They were gone by noon. The regional depot in Des Moines had 11. Those were allocated by morning. After that, the system gave a lead time nobody in the county wanted to hear in the middle of harvest. 5 business days. Possibly 7. Now let me tell you what 5 business days means in the 3rd week of October when 41% of the county's corn is still standing and a rain band is walking east across Iowa like it owns the map. It means truck drivers lean on fenders and stop joking. It means elevators get backed up with the few combines still moving. It means custom crews start triaging which fields matter most. It means every mechanic who can hold a wrench gets a phone call. It means farmers begin standing in dealership offices in the posture of men trying not to turn anger into panic. By October 15, 12 combines were down across Mercer, Henderson, and Warren counties with some version of the same feeder drive failure. 1 machine had cracked the hub entirely. 2 had thrown enough heat into the bearing carrier to discolor the paint. One had twisted the shaft hard enough that the splines on both mating surfaces looked like somebody had filed them with a grinder. Another had taken out the mounting bracket when the coupler let go under load and the feeder house shocked sideways. Trent Calloway stood in his service bay at 7:10 that morning with 3 machine owners waiting and told them what the system told him. The parts were coming. They were not here. It would be about a week. One of those owners was a farmer named Luke Benner, 38 years old, 1,100 acres, 1 modern combine, 1 hired man, 1 wet wife waiting on test results for a second child, and 0 patience for the phrase about a week when 640 acres of corn were still out. Luke asked what he was supposed to do until then. Trent said, "I don't know what to tell you." That same afternoon, Luke Benner drove out to Vernon Hale's place, not because he thought Vernon had the answer, but because men in farm country go where stories go when the official channels fail. Someone at the co-op had said Vernon used to keep old feeder drives from machines nobody remembered. Someone else had said Vernon once rebuilt a clean-grain elevator gearbox from 3 dead units and ran it 14 more years. Someone else said if any man in the county would have a shaft, a housing, or a casting close enough to save a crop, it would be Vernon. Luke found him in the machine shed with a grease gun in one hand and a trouble light hanging from a nail. He told Vernon what was failing. Vernon asked 3 questions. What side? How hot? Splines or housing first? Luke said the dealer thought the coupler itself was too light. Vernon stood still for a moment. Then he asked what diameter the stub shaft was. Luke did not know. Vernon asked whether the carrier was 4-bolt or 3-bolt. Luke did not know that either. Then Vernon did a thing that people who have spent their lives around machinery sometimes do when other people are still describing the problem in words. He reached for a pad, wrote down 3 measurements from memory, and said, "If it's the revision I think it is, they saved 12 pounds of steel and lost 30 years of sense." That evening Luke came back with the broken parts in the bed of his pickup. Vernon set them on the bench under a fluorescent light and looked at them for a long time. He did not pick them up right away. He just looked. Men who know machinery at depth often begin with stillness. They let shapes talk before tools do. He ran one thumb along the fractured hub. He looked at the wear polish around the carrier seat. He set a caliper on the shaft. Then he said, mostly to himself, "There it is." What Vernon recognized was not simply the failure. It was the family resemblance. The failed coupler shared nearly the same working dimensions as an older drive arrangement used on a run of pull-type corn heads and early self-propelled feeder drives from the late 1970s, heavier castings, thicker walls, coarser but deeper load paths, less elegant, less efficient in a catalog, but far more tolerant of shock, dirt, and the kind of field improvisation that keeps rural counties alive. He told Luke to help him open the barn. "Let me tell you about that barn door, because in this story it matters." It was a double slider, bottom track bent years before by a loader tire, the wood silvered by weather and the iron latch polished by hands that had opened it in every season. When Vernon pulled it back, the smell that came out was dry timber, old grease, mice, dust, and machine history. Most men would have seen clutter. Luke Benner saw categories he did not yet understand. Vernon saw inventory. He walked to the third bay on the left, moved 2 seed cleaner screens, lifted a cardboard box filled with PTO shields, and dragged out a cast iron drive housing with a flange big enough to anchor a church bell. Then he pulled 2 more. Then an older splined coupler. Then a stack of carrier brackets. Then 3 shafts wrapped in oily paper so old the paper had become part of the preservation. Luke said, "You knew those were in here?" Vernon said, "I knew where the heavy ones were." That night they laid the broken modern assembly next to the old drive parts and began measuring. Vernon's son, Mark Hale, 52 that year and practical in the way sons of methodical men often become, joined them after supper. By 9:40, they had concluded three things. First, the old housings had more wall thickness than the revised dealer parts by enough to matter. Second, the shaft centerline could be adapted with a spacer plate and a re-drilled bracket. Third, if they used the older cast coupler body with a machined sleeve and changed the bearing arrangement, they could build a retrofit strong enough to survive wet corn loads. It would not be factory. It would not be catalog. It would not carry a sticker that made lawyers feel calm. But it would turn. Mark called a machine shop in Galesburg run by a man named David Schertz who had been cutting keyways and saving harvests for 26 years. David listened. He did not laugh. He asked for shaft dimensions, spline count, flange spacing, and whether Vernon wanted 1 sleeve or 12 if he could get stock in the morning. Vernon said, "Make 12. David said, "I'll start at 6. Now let me tell you what happened across the county while Vernon Hale was in his barn turning junk into options. 3 more combines failed on the 16th. 2 on the 17th before noon. A custom cutter out of Monmouth parked both of his machines because he had one broken and one making noise he did not trust. The elevator line at Alexis thinned not because there was less corn, but because there were fewer working machines left to bring it in. One dealership south of the county line began rationing used parts by relationship. Another dealer told a farmer in Henderson County he could overnight one assembly for a premium price that made the farmer sit down before answering. The rain still had not fully arrived, which somehow made it worse. Every field standing under a dry sky looked like an accusation. By the morning of October 18th, Luke Benner's machine was still in Vernon's shed, nose open, feeder drive stripped, waiting on sleeves from Galesburg. 2 other farmers had already arrived with broken assemblies in their pickups. Word had outrun certainty. It always does. They had heard Vernon might have something. Not parts. Not exactly. A way. Vernon never liked crowds in the shop, but that week he tolerated them because there was no point fighting urgency once it had found your driveway. He lined the broken assemblies along the wall and tagged each one with the owner's name in marker. He made a list. Machine model. Year. Shaft damage. Carrier damage. Mounting bracket condition. Secondary losses. At 11:20, David Schertz came up the lane in a flatbed with 6 machine sleeves wrapped in oily cloth and a plate of rough-cut spacer blanks stacked behind them. Vernon looked at the sleeves, turned one in his hand, and nodded once. That was David's receipt of approval. They rebuilt Luke Benner's coupler first. It took 4 hours. The old housing needed minor clearance work. The spacer plate had to be drilled twice because Vernon trusted a punch mark more than a tape. Mark fitted the bearings. David cleaned the sleeve edges with emery cloth. Luke handed tools and tried not to get in the way in the particular helpless rhythm of a man whose crop is waiting on other people's competence. At 4:35 that afternoon they slid the rebuilt drive into place. Vernon torqued the last fastener himself. Luke started the machine. The feeder house rolled. They let it idle. Then faster. Then under load with a wagon of shelled corn fed steady to test vibration through the drive. Vernon stood with one hand on the side panel, not because that told him anything a gauge could not, but because some men like to feel machinery answer back. It ran smooth. Luke took the machine to a 40-acre field west of the creek and cut until 10:15 that night. Not one callback. Not one heat line. Not one new noise. He was back at Vernon's yard by dawn asking if they could do the next one. Let me tell you about the next 4 days, because they are the reason men in Mercer County still mention the Hale barn as if it were a building and a method at the same time. They rebuilt 11 machines in 4 days. Not all from the exact same parts. That would make the story too neat, and real repair never is. Some needed only the heavier housing and machined sleeve. Some needed a different shaft salvaged from older feeder drives. 2 needed bracket reinforcement. One machine had damaged the mounting plane enough that Mark Hale fabricated a backer plate from quarter-inch stock to spread the load into healthier steel. Another required Vernon to pull a coupler body from a dust-coated shelf so high in the barn that his grandson, Eli, had to climb the ladder because Vernon's knees had long since negotiated a lower relationship with gravity. They worked from daylight into the dark under halogen lamps and the sort of practical silence that settles over serious jobs. Farmers brought casseroles, coffee, thermoses, sandwiches, old castings, rumors, and gratitude in uneven quantities. David Shirts kept machining sleeves. Mark kept fitting. Vernon kept selecting, measuring, correcting, and saying little until it mattered. By Tuesday morning, enough of the county's stalled machines were moving again that the elevator line came back to life. By Wednesday afternoon, farmers who had been promised a week were back in fields they had thought they might lose to weather. By Thursday night, the rain finally came, but by then the county had put down enough acres that men listened to it on the windows with less fear than they had 3 days earlier. Trent Calloway heard all of this the way local dealers hear everything that threatens to reorder the logic of their own importance, in fragments first, then with names attached. One customer said Vernon Hale had rebuilt Luke's machine from old parts. Another said there were 4 combines running on retrofits out of Vernon's barn. Another said 8. Another said Vernon had more working knowledge in his rafters than the factory had in its revised coupler. Trent drove out on October 22. He did not call first. He pulled into the yard around noon and found 3 pickups by the barn, 1 service truck from a neighboring county, and a combine parked half in the lane with its side panel open. Vernon was at the bench with safety glasses low on his nose and one of David's machined sleeves in his hand. Mark was fitting a bearing. Luke Benner was sweeping metal chips. A farmer from Warren County stood holding a cracked carrier housing like it had personally insulted him. Trent took in the scene. Then he looked at the barn. The door was open wide. Shelves ran into shadow. Parts hung and stacked and waited exactly where Vernon had said they would wait 20 years earlier when Trent first laughed. Trent walked in and picked up one of the old cast housings from the bench. It was heavier than the revised unit. That fact alone said more than any salesman's sheet ever could. He looked at the sleeve. He looked at the spacer plate. He looked at the repaired assembly already painted with nothing but a light coat of primer to keep the weather off the new metal until harvest was through. Then he said, "How many have you done?" Vernon said, 9 that are back in fields. 2 still here. Trent said, "Any come back?" Vernon said, "No." There was a silence. Then Trent said the sentence that, if a man is honest, can cost him more to say than the wrong sentence cost him to believe. "I told people this place was full of junk." Vernon set the sleeve down on the bench and said, "It was always full of parts. Problem just hadn't arrived yet." That was the entire correction. No speech. No triumph. No theatrical settling of accounts. Which is often how men like Vernon win. Trent stayed another 40 minutes. Long enough to understand what he was looking at and, more importantly, what he had failed to see for years. He had thought Vernon's barn was a refusal to move on. What it was, in fact, was distributed resilience. It was a physical record of all the load cases, shaft sizes, cast forms, bolt patterns, and old engineering assumptions that modern systems had left behind in the pursuit of speed, efficiency, and cost. He went back to the dealership and did something unexpected. He called 2 customers still waiting on factory parts and told them to take their broken assemblies to Vernon Hale if they wanted to be running before the week was out. He did not have to do that. It did not make him money. But the truth of a situation does not become less true because it embarrasses the man saying it. By the end of harvest, Vernon Hale's barn had contributed parts, patterns, castings, or adaptations to 15 repaired combines across 3 counties. Not all of them were permanent solutions. Vernon was clear about that. 4 of the machines later went back to factory assemblies during winter service once redesigned parts became available. 3 kept the Hale retrofits for another full season. 2 of Luke Benner's neighbors asked David Schertz to machine spare sleeves before spring planting because they had no intention of getting caught by a supplier revision twice. The revised factory parts that came later were heavier. That is worth noting. The new service bulletin changed wall thickness, altered bearing support geometry, and specified inspection intervals that looked remarkably like an admission written in engineering language. Nobody from the manufacturer called Vernon Hale. They did not need to. The machines had already testified. Now let me tell you what happened to the barn after that harvest, because good stories do not end at the moment of proof. They continue into the slower question of whether anyone actually learns anything. Mark Hale began reorganizing one section of the barn that winter. Not cleaning it out. Not reducing it into correctness for the comfort of younger men. Organizing it. He and Vernon built new shelves from oak plank and angle iron. They separated feeder drives from separator parts, corn head gear cases from unloading auger components, hydraulic salvage from mechanical salvage. Eli, Vernon's grandson, 23 years old then and fresh out of community college with just enough welding skill to be useful and just enough confidence to be dangerous, began entering part dimensions into a spreadsheet because he had the modern instinct to digitize what his grandfather had always kept in pencil. Vernon pretended not to care about the spreadsheet. Then he started correcting the column headings. Trent Calloway came out twice that winter. The first time with a box of old dealer records showing superseded part cross-references from machine lines his dealership no longer serviced. The second time with 3 obsolete feeder drive assemblies he had found in a back storeroom and nearly sent to scrap 10 years earlier. He set them just inside the barn door and said, "Thought maybe these belonged somewhere that understood them." Vernon said, "Set them by the heavy ones." That was as close to reconciliation as the county required. Luke Benner finished harvest that year with losses lower than he had feared and higher than he preferred, which is another way of saying he finished like a farmer. The child his wife was carrying was born in March. He named the boy Raymond, not after Vernon, but after Vernon's father once he heard the story of how far back the habit of saving useful things went in that family. Vernon himself kept farming until 2014. He died in 2016 at 87 years old. The last entry in his notebook regarding the barn was written in February of that year beside a line item for a cast feeder drive housing pulled from the east wall shelf. He had written, in neat block letters, "Still good if a man knows what it is." There are sentences that explain a whole life if you find them late enough. The barn still stands. Mark Hale still farms the ground. Eli still welds. The spreadsheet has expanded, though Vernon's pencil labels remain because no electronic system has yet improved on the usefulness of a note exactly where a hand reaches for it. 3 of the repaired combines from 2008 are gone now, traded, dismantled, or sent south. But one of Luke Benner's old retrofit parts, a heavier housing with a machined sleeve from David Schertz's shop, still hangs on a nail in the Hale machine shed, cleaned, tagged, and kept not as a trophy but as a reminder. A reminder of what? Of several things. That a system can be efficient and still be fragile. That a dealer can know a lot and still not know enough. That a barn full of old castings can look like failure to a man trained only to see inventory turns. That harvest, like weather, has a way of locating the difference between what is current and what is durable. And maybe most of all, it is a reminder that some barns are not full of junk. They are full of postponed usefulness. They are full of answers waiting on the right failure. They are full of the patient categories made by men who paid attention longer than other people thought necessary. In October of 2008, Mercer County did not need nostalgia. It needed steel. It needed fit. It needed geometry. It needed a way to turn again before the rain came. Vernon Hale had that way in a barn other people laughed at for 30 years. The dealer said it was full of junk. Then harvest broke down across the county. And all at once, the county discovered that the difference between junk and salvation is often nothing more than whether the man looking at it understands what problem it was built to solve.